The train was late by nearly 2 hours, which Evelyn Hart might have taken as a sign if she had been the kind of person who believed in signs. She wasn't. She believed in schedules and written agreements and the reliability of things that had been promised. So when the locomotive finally groaned to a halt at what the conductor called Millbrook Station, though station was a generous word for 3 warped boards nailed together and a rusted sign half swallowed by sage, she stepped off with her 2 suitcases and fully expected to find someone waiting. There was no one. The platform, such as it was, stood empty in the last gray light of an October afternoon. Wind moved through the scrub in long, low waves. The train hissed steam for a minute or two, passengers shuffled on and off farther up the line, and then the locomotive lurched forward again, and the sound of it faded west until she couldn't hear it anymore. Just the wind, just the sage, just the enormous, indifferent Wyoming sky going dark at its edges. Evelyn set her bags down and stood very still. She had a letter. She had carried it for 6 days, folded inside her coat pocket, and she pulled it out now and read it again as though the words might have changed since Illinois. They hadn't. The Millbrook Station stop, it said, in the careful handwriting of the Cedar Ridge School Board, where a representative will meet you and convey you the remaining distance to town. The remaining distance. She had asked, in her reply letter, how far that was, and the response had never come. She looked around. The road, dirt, rutted badly, ran north and south. To the east, a low ridge of rock caught the last of the sun. To the west, the land flattened into shadow. She could see no lights, no buildings, nothing that looked like it might have a lantern burning in a window. She put the letter back in her pocket. She had left Decatur, Illinois with $73 and a great deal of conviction. The conviction had seemed like enough when she was packing. Her father had stood in the doorway of the farmhouse and watched her load her bags into the neighbor's wagon, and his expression had been the particular kind of flat and unreadable that she had come to understand over 19 years meant he thought she was making a mistake but had decided not to say so again. He had said it plenty before that morning. There are schools here, Evelyn. There are perfectly reasonable teaching positions in towns where people know your name. She had not wanted a town where people knew her name. She had wanted something she couldn't quite articulate. A beginning, maybe. A place where she could build something from nothing, where she wasn't somebody's daughter or somebody's neighbor's girl. Wyoming had advertised a teacher position. She had applied. They had accepted her. That had felt at the time like a clear line of cause and effect. Standing now in the gathering dark with wind pulling at her coat, the logic felt considerably less solid. She picked up both suitcases. The larger one on the right was too heavy for comfort and pulled her shoulder badly, and walked to the edge of the platform. The road went north. She had no particular reason to choose north over south, but north felt like it had more intention to it, and she needed intention right now. She set the bags down again and tried to think practically. She had matches. She had a wool blanket packed in the larger case. She had half a loaf of bread and some dried apple slices wrapped in cloth. She was cold, but not dangerously cold. Not yet. The temperature was dropping, but she was dressed adequately. These were the facts. She listed them deliberately in her head the way her mother had taught her to do when she was frightened. Find what is true, Evelyn, and stand on that. Her mother had been dead for 4 years. Evelyn still heard her voice sometimes in moments like this, and she couldn't decide if that was a comfort or just another kind of loss. She was trying to determine whether to open the larger suitcase and retrieve the blanket now or wait another half hour and see if anyone appeared, when she heard a horse, not close, maybe a quarter-mile up the road coming from the north. The sound of hooves on hard dirt carried well in that flat country, and she stood up straight and faced the sound and felt the particular alertness that comes when you are alone in a dark place and something is approaching that you cannot yet see. The horse appeared first as a shape against the sky, a dark mass that resolved slowly into a man on horseback, moving at a steady walk. He was leading a second horse on a rope. He was tall in the saddle, broad across the shoulders, wearing a coat that had seen considerable use. He didn't seem to be in any hurry. He hadn't, from his posture, seen her yet. Evelyn did not move. When he was close enough that she could see his face, angular, weathered, somewhere in his early 30s, with a hat pulled against the wind, he registered her presence and pulled up short. The horse shifted under him, and he steadied it with one hand on the rein without much apparent effort. They looked at each other for a moment. "You the teacher?" he said. His voice was flat, not unkind, but not warm either. "I am." She straightened slightly. "I'm Evelyn Hart. I was told someone would meet me." Something crossed his face, a quick tightening, not quite irritation, not quite something else. That was supposed to be Gus Hensley. He runs the livery. He looked up the road and then back at her. "His boy had an accident this afternoon. Fell off a fence, broke his arm. Gus sent word he couldn't come, but I suppose that word didn't reach you." "No," she said. "It did not." He looked at the two suitcases, then at her, then at the sky, which was now genuinely dark at its eastern edge. "How long have you been standing here?" "Since the train came through, approximately 2 hours ago." A muscle moved in his jaw. 2 hours, he said, mostly to himself. He swung down from the saddle in one motion, landing without ceremony. He was taller standing than he'd appeared mounted, which was something. "Nathan Reed," he said. He did not extend his hand. "I've got a ranch about 4 miles north. I was coming back from Keller's Creek and took the road past the station out of habit. Lucky thing." "Lucky," she agreed, though the word came out a little drier than she'd intended. He reached down and picked up the larger suitcase without asking and tied it behind the saddle of the second horse, the one he'd been leading. He did this competently and without commentary. Then he looked at the smaller case. "That one you can manage yourself, or you want it up there too?" "I can manage it," she said. "Then get on." He nodded at the second horse. "She's gentle. Name's Clara." Evelyn looked at Clara. Clara was, in fact, a calm-looking sorrel mare who was currently expressing no opinion about any of this. Evelyn had ridden horses, though not recently and not often. She put her foot in the stirrup, swung up, and settled into the saddle with slightly more difficulty than she would have liked, the small suitcase balanced awkwardly across her lap. Nathan Reed did not comment on the difficulty. He was already mounted again, turning his horse north. They rode for a while without speaking. The dark came on fully around them, and a half-moon rose, which helped. The road was visible as a pale stripe through the sage. The cold deepened, and Evelyn shifted her grip on the suitcase and kept her eyes on the road ahead, and thought about the school that was waiting for her in Cedar Ridge, about the children who would be in it, about the smell of chalk, and the particular satisfaction of watching someone understand something for the first time. She thought about those things deliberately because she needed to think about something other than the fact that she was riding through total darkness in a place she didn't know with a man she had met 10 minutes ago. "How far is Cedar Ridge?" she asked. "Another 3 miles, give or take. We'll stop at my ranch first, let you warm up. It's on the way." "I don't want to be any trouble." "You're not any trouble," he said, in a tone that was factual rather than reassuring. She considered that. "You don't have to say that." "I know I don't," he said. "I said it because it's true. You didn't ask to be left standing in the dark. That's not trouble. That's just bad luck." She looked at the side of his face. He was watching the road. There was nothing in his expression that seemed to be performing anything, no particular effort at kindness, just a plain accounting of what had happened and what was reasonable to do about it. She found unexpectedly that she appreciated that more than she would have appreciated actual warmth. "Thank you," she said, "for coming back on this road." "It was habit," he said. "Don't thank me for habit, Bob." The ranch appeared as a cluster of lights through scrub, a main house, a barn, and what looked like a smaller outbuilding. It was not large, but it was substantial enough, built of timber that had weathered gray and tight, with a covered porch running along the front. A dog met them at the gate, a big brown animal that circled the horses without barking, apparently satisfied with whatever it had determined. Nathan tied both horses and opened the front door and held it. Evelyn carried her small suitcase inside. The interior was plain and ordered, which surprised her slightly. She hadn't formed a clear expectation, but whatever she'd half imagined, the bachelor squalor she'd heard described in frontier accounts, was not what she found. The main room had a stone fireplace with a fire burning low in it, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books, a braided rug that had seen better days but was clean. There was a coat on a hook by the door and a pair of boots beside it. Everything was worn but placed deliberately. There was also a woman. She was maybe 50, with gray streaked hair pinned up and an apron over her dress, standing at the stove, and she turned when they came in with the particular expression of someone who had been expecting one person and gotten two. "Mrs. Alcott," Nathan said, "this is Miss Evelyn Hart. She's the new teacher. She was left at the station, the Hensley situation." He said this as though it explained everything, and the woman, Mrs. Alcott, nodded as though it did. Come in, come in." She came forward and took Evelyn's coat without asking. "You must be half frozen. Nathan, fix the fire. I'll get the coffee." She said this to Nathan as though she said it frequently and expected to be obeyed. Nathan fixed the fire without comment. Mrs. Alcott, it turned out, kept house for Nathan 3 days a week and had been doing so for 6 years. She explained this while pressing a tin cup of coffee into Evelyn's hands and studying her with the frank, assessing gaze of someone who had lived long enough to not bother being indirect. "You're younger than I expected," she said. "The board's last teacher was 42, didn't stay past the first winter." "I intend to stay," Evelyn said. "That's what she said, too." Mrs. Alcott did not say this cruelly. She said it the way you'd say the weather was likely to turn, as a matter of observed pattern. "The winters here are real, Miss Hart. Not Illinois cold. Real cold. I'm aware." The woman poured herself coffee and sat across the table. "You have people back in Illinois?" "My father." She paused. "My mother passed 4 years ago. I'm sorry." A beat of genuine quiet. "What made you want to come out here? Specifically out here, I mean. There are schools closer to—" "Because out here felt like it had room for something new," Evelyn said, and then felt slightly embarrassed by how plainly she'd said it. But Mrs. Alcott just looked at her steadily and nodded. "That's not a bad reason," she said. Nathan came back from the fire and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter rather than sitting. He had taken his hat off. His hair was dark and slightly too long, curling at the back of his neck where it reached his collar. There was a scar along his left jaw. Thin, old, the kind that takes years to go that pale. "School building's in decent shape," he said. "The board had the roof redone in August. Stove works. You'll need to clear it out. It's been used for storage, but the structure's sound." He said this to the room rather than to her specifically, the way people sometimes relay practical information without making eye contact. "When is the first day?" "Board set it for 2 weeks from Monday. Gives you time to settle and get the room ready." 2 weeks. She turned her cup in her hands. "That's good. That's enough time." "If you work fast," Mrs. Alcott said. "Not critically, just honestly." Cedar Ridge, when she finally saw it the following morning in daylight, was smaller than she'd expected. She had known it was small. The board's letter had said, "a growing settlement of approximately 200 souls." But there was a difference between reading that number and standing on the main street and watching 200 people's worth of evidence move past you. The street was unpaved. There was a general store, a feed merchant, a smithy, a building that appeared to serve variously as a courthouse, a meeting hall, and possibly a post office, depending on who you asked. There was a saloon that seemed to conduct more business before noon than Evelyn would have guessed. There were perhaps 40 or 50 houses fanning out from the main street in patterns that owed more to pragmatism than planning. Wherever land had been cleared, there a house stood. The schoolhouse sat at the north end, set slightly back from the street, with a yard around it that was more dirt than anything else. It was a single-room structure, maybe 30 by 20 feet, with 4 windows and a plank door that opened stiffly and emitted, when Evelyn pushed it, a considerable quantity of settled dust and the smell of old rope. She stood in the doorway for a moment and took it in. Inside, 10 desks in various states of assembly, 3 pushed to one side and clearly broken, a blackboard mounted on the front wall that was usable but badly chalked, a wood stove that appeared functional, several crates that turned out to contain, on inspection, miscellaneous hardware, 1 bushel of dried beans, and a considerable accumulation of items that people had apparently been using the building to store since it was last in educational use, which, according to the town's acting postmaster, a lean, talkative man named Calvin Dodd, had been the better part of a year ago. "The last teacher was a man named Pickett," Calvin Dodd said, leaning in the doorway while Evelyn surveyed the broken desks. "Came in September, left in December, said the isolation got to him." "The isolation," she said. "Yep, just him in the quiet," he said. "Couldn't bear it." Calvin tilted his head. "You find quiet bothersome?" "No," she said. "I find it useful." He He smiled at that. Calvin Dodd was maybe 35, with the particular manner of a man who knows most of what goes on in a small town because he's positioned himself to hear it. But he wasn't malicious about it, from what she could tell. He was just interested. "Well," he said, "you'll get plenty of it, particularly January through March." She was already examining the stove. She needed iron wire, she determined, for the stovepipe section that had separated slightly at a joint. She needed wood for the desks that could be repaired and someone who knew how to work it. She needed chalk, new chalk, not the crumbling remnants she found at the base of the blackboard. She needed a broom. She thought, about 4 solid days of uninterrupted work. She went to the general store and spent $11 on supplies. The man behind the counter, heavy-set, efficient, named Barlow, looked her up and down with open curiosity as he wrapped her purchases. "You're the new teacher," he said. "Yes." "How old are you?" 19. He wrote something in his ledger and didn't say anything more. She couldn't tell if the silence was skeptical or merely neutral, but she paid him and carried her supplies back to the schoolhouse and got to work. The first 2 weeks were the kind of difficult that she had not, in honesty, fully anticipated. Not impossible, not overwhelming, but difficult in the specific grinding way of physical labor combined with social navigation, combined with loneliness, all at once, all the time. She was staying in a room above the general store that Barlow rented at a rate she could just manage on her salary, which was to say barely. The room was small, the bed was adequate, and the stove smoked when the wind came from the west. She cleaned the schoolhouse herself, 4 days running. She repaired 2 of the broken desks with wood and iron brackets and help from the blacksmith, a quiet man named Wallace, who charged her less than his posted rate and didn't say why. She pulled the crates out into the yard and sorted through them and returned what was returnable and stacked what was not, and she chalked the blackboard 3 times over before it held line evenly, and she hauled wood for the stove from the pile behind the building until her arms stopped complaining and accepted the work. She met people in pieces. The women who came to look at her in the store politely, with the measuring quality of people deciding whether to extend trust. The men who nodded at her from across the street with expressions that ranged from neutral to wary. A woman named Ida Marsh, who ran the town's only dressmaker's shop, and seemed to have decided immediately that Evelyn was competent, and said so plainly, and became something close to an ally. An older couple, the Garfields, who brought her a pie the second week, just knocked on the schoolhouse door while she was working and left it on the front step when she answered, and the pie was apple and slightly oversweetened and was, at that moment, one of the most appreciated gestures she had ever received. She heard more about Nathan Reed than she saw him. He came into town roughly once a week, she learned. He kept a cattle operation north of town. Not enormous, but not struggling either, from what people said, though what people said had the particular reliability of small-town assessment, which is to say, inconsistent. He had bought the ranch 5 years earlier from a man who'd gone back east for health reasons. He didn't socialize much. He was well-regarded from what she could piece together, the kind of well-regarded that comes from reliability rather than charm, from showing up when you said you would and doing what needed doing. The scar on his jaw, she learned from Ida, was from a fence accident 3 years prior. Nothing dramatic, just a moment of inattention and a length of barbed wire. She didn't know why she kept track of these small pieces of information about a man she had no particular reason to think about, except that he had found her in the dark when it had mattered, and she was the kind of person who didn't forget things like that. The school opened on a Monday, as scheduled. 7 children arrived that first morning. She had been told to expect 14, but she had also been told by Ida that some families would wait and see, that there was a practical skepticism about new teachers in Cedar Ridge at this point, given recent history. 7 was not nothing. She arranged them in the desk she'd repaired, 3 boys and 4 girls, ranging from age 6 to 13, and she wrote her name on the board, and she told them that she was glad to be there, and that they were going to work hard, and that she expected them to ask every question they actually had rather than the ones they thought they were supposed to ask. A girl named Lucy Marsh, Ida's youngest, raised her hand immediately. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Are you going to leave like Mr. Pickett did?" The room went very still. "No," Evelyn said. "I am not." Lucy considered this with the unfiltered gravity of an 8-year-old taking in new information. How come you're sure? Because I didn't come this far to leave. She said it without drama. It was just true, and something in the plainness of it seemed to satisfy Lucy, because she nodded and sat back. The boy beside her, she'd learned he was called Sam Rafferty, son of the feed merchant, looked at Evelyn with the particular sidelong assessment of a 9-year-old who's been disappointed before. Mr. Pickett said that too, Sam said. I know he did, Evelyn said. But I'm saying it now, and I mean it now. And you don't have to believe me yet. You'll see for yourself. Sam chewed his lip. All right, he said finally. I guess we'll see. Yes, she said. We will. She taught them arithmetic and letters and geography, and in the afternoon read them a chapter of Treasure Island, because she believed that reading aloud was how you taught people that stories were worth sitting still for. By 3 o'clock, she was exhausted in a way that was specific to the particular drain of being watched and assessed for 7 hours by people who hadn't yet decided whether to trust you. But she walked home with all 7 children having returned for the afternoon session, which was not guaranteed and which she counted as the day's essential success. The second week, 3 more children appeared, then 2 more the week after. Nathan came to the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week, when she was working late marking arithmetic papers. She heard the knock and called, "Come in," expecting Calvin Dodd, who had gotten into the habit of stopping by around this time. It was not Calvin Dodd. Nathan stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, which she noticed because it was a small gesture of consideration, the hat, and he was not the kind of man who made small gestures unnecessarily. He looked at the papers spread on her desk and the equation she'd half erased on the blackboard and didn't say anything for a moment. "How is it going?" he said. She set her pen down. "Better than I expected and harder than I expected, both at once." He nodded, as though this was precisely the sort of answer that made sense to him. "I heard 12 students now." 12. I'm hoping for 3 more by winter. The Halbert children, if their father can be persuaded. He's stubborn, Nathan said. I'm more stubborn. Something shifted in his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. He came in and sat in the chair beside her desk, not because she'd invited him, but because standing in the doorway for an extended conversation was impractical, and he was apparently a practical man. He put his hat on the desk with a kind of unconscious deliberateness. "Board is pleased," he said. Calvin was talking at the store. "Calvin talks everywhere." "He does," Nathan agreed. "But in this case, he's saying something true. They weren't sure when you applied. 19 seemed young, no prior experience in a frontier setting." "I know," she said. "I knew that was what they were thinking." "But they were short on options," he said, not cruelly. "And you wrote a good letter." "I wrote an honest letter." "Same thing," he said, "if you're doing it right." She looked at him across the desk. He was looking at the papers, not at her, and she took the opportunity to look at his face more directly than she had before. The lines around his eyes that said outdoors and years, the jaw that was more set than tense, the way he held himself with the particular careful stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was useful. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. He was something more than that, and also less a face that had been used, that had done things that would not have looked right in a parlor. "You're on the school board," she said. "I'm on the school board," he confirmed. "1 of 5. I voted to offer you the position." "Why?" He looked at her then. "Because your letter said you understood the position was difficult and you wanted it anyway. Most letters we got said the position sounded wonderful. Yours said it sounded hard and you were still interested. That seemed more reliable." She thought about the night he'd found her at the station, the way he'd picked up her suitcase without asking and tied it behind the saddle and said, "Get on without ceremony." The way he'd said, "You're not any trouble," like it was just a fact. "You assess things pretty carefully," she said. "I try to," he said. "Most people would find that cold." "Most people probably do," he said, without apparent distress about this. He picked up his hat from the desk. "I came because I wanted to see how the building was holding up. The stovepipe joint. Wallace fixed it, but it should be checked before the real cold." "It's fine," she said. "Wallace did good work." "Good." He stood. "If anything gives trouble, send word to the ranch. Mrs. Alcott will relay a message when she comes in." "I will," she said. Thank you, Nathan. She had used his given name without thinking about it, and she noticed it an instant after she'd done it. He seemed to notice it too, briefly, a slight pause at the door. Miss Hart, he said, and then he was gone. She sat for a moment looking at the door after it closed and then looked back at her arithmetic papers and picked up her pen and told herself to concentrate. She was mostly successful. Mostly. By the end of October, she had 14 students. The Halbert children came, as she'd predicted. It had taken 2 visits to the homestead, one conversation with the father that she would not describe as comfortable, and one conversation with the mother that went considerably better. The mother had looked at her for a long moment before saying, "You don't seem like someone who gives up easily." Evelyn had said, "I'm not," and the children had started the following Monday. The community was warming to her, slowly, in the way that frontier towns warm to anyone, not through sudden embrace but through accumulation. She was present. She did what she said she would do. She showed up every morning regardless of weather. She stayed late when children needed it, and she did not complain about the conditions, at least not publicly. Privately, she wrote long letters to her father that were more honest than the ones she'd sent before leaving Illinois, and she burned some of them and sent others. And in one that she did send, she wrote, "It is genuinely hard here. Not in the ways I expected. The cold is a fact and the isolation is a fact, but neither of those are the thing that tests me. The thing that tests me is proving to people every single day that I deserve to be trusted. That does not get easier. I do not expect it to, but I'm still here." Her father wrote back, as he usually did, briefly. "Your mother would have said the same things you're saying. I don't know if that's encouraging or if it's just what I notice. Stay warm." She folded that letter and kept it, unlike some of the others. November came, and with it a cold that was different in quality than anything she had encountered. Not merely temperature, but a kind of presence, as though the cold were a thing with weight and intention rather than just an absence of warmth. She learned to lay her fire before she left in the morning so the room would be warm when she returned. She learned to keep water from freezing by banking embers in a particular way. She learned to read the sky, a little. Calvin Dodd taught her some of this, and Wallace the blacksmith added more, and she paid attention with the particular intensity of someone who understands that ignorance has physical consequences. She and Nathan crossed paths perhaps once a week. In town, usually, brief encounters in the street or the store, where they spoke for a few minutes about practical things and then went on. She couldn't have said what exactly these conversations were, what category they belonged to. Not friendship, not exactly. Not the comfortable back and forth of people who had chosen to know each other. More like, she tried to find the word, people who had assessed each other and found the assessment worthwhile and were cautious about the next step and hadn't decided yet whether to take it. He came to the school one more time in November, again on a Thursday afternoon, again nominally to check the building. This time she was not working late. She was teaching 5 of her older students a geography lesson, and he knocked. And she called, "Come in," and he opened the door and stopped when he saw the class in session. "Sorry," he said immediately. "I'll come back." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Children, this is Mr. Reed. He is on the school board. He built one of the desks you're sitting in." She hadn't been certain of this until 2 days ago when Mrs. Alcott mentioned it in passing, that Nathan had made 3 of the repaired desks himself, brought them over in the wagon one afternoon when she'd been out. She had not been told this at the time. The children looked at Nathan with the frank interest of children examining someone who has been described as important. Nathan looked at the children with the expression of a man who had not expected to be introduced to 9-year-olds and was adjusting his approach. "Hello?" he said. "Hello, Mr. Reed," several of them said, with the particular ragged unison of children who have been learning to respond in chorus. Sam Rafferty was watching Nathan with an expression that Evelyn had come to recognize as the boy's version of serious consideration. "Did you really build the desks?" Sam asked. 3 of them, Nathan said. "How come you didn't tell us?" Sam asked, apparently addressing this to Evelyn. "Because Mr. Reed brought them quietly, without saying anything about it," she said. "And sometimes that's the best way to do something." Sam thought about this. Nathan looked at the floor briefly, which was as close to being flustered as she had ever seen him. She taught the rest of the lesson with him standing just inside the doorway, watching. and she was aware of his presence the entire time, but did not find it distracting, which surprised her. When the children filed out at the end, she organized her maps, and he checked the stovepipe and the seal on the window she'd reported as loose. "The window needs new caulking," he said. "I'll get it done before real winter." "That would be appreciated," she said. A silence settled, not uncomfortable. Outside, the children's voices faded down the street. "Sam Rafferty," she said, "the boy who asked about the desks. He's the sharpest student I have, but he doesn't believe it yet. He thinks trying and still getting something wrong is a character flaw rather than just learning." Nathan looked at her. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you brought him a desk and didn't say anything," she said, "which means you pay attention to what's needed rather than what's noticed. And I think that's the same thing that boy needs from someone, and I thought you might be interested to know." A longer pause. "His father's not an easy man," Nathan said finally. "Henry Rafferty. Makes it hard on the boy, the expectation." "I know," she said. "I've met Henry Rafferty." "I'll keep an eye on it," Nathan said. Then, "The caulking will be done Thursday." "Thank you," she said. He put his hat on and walked out. She stood in the empty schoolroom for a moment, listening to the silence the children had left behind, and then she went back to her papers. She was, she thought, starting to understand this place. Not fully, not easily, but the edges of it were becoming readable to her, and that was something. That was, in fact, everything. The winter was still coming, but she was still here. The caulking got done on Thursday, as promised. She wasn't there when it happened. She was at the Garfields' house that afternoon, helping Vera Garfield write a letter to a relative back in Ohio, which had somehow become a semi-regular arrangement after the pie. But when she returned to the schoolhouse, she could smell the fresh sealant around the north window and feel, standing close to it, that the cold draft that had been leaking through the gap all week was gone. He hadn't left a note. There was nothing to indicate he'd been there except the work itself. And she stood at that window for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the sealed edge and felt something she didn't quite know how to name. She named it practical gratitude and moved on. December announced itself with a week of gray skies and winds that came down from the north carrying a fine, dry snow that wasn't heavy enough to be a true storm, but was cold enough to matter. The children arrived at school with red ears and watering eyes, stomping their boots on the step before they came in, and Evelyn made a habit of having the stove burning well before they arrived, so the room was warm when the first ones came through the door. This was a small thing, but she noticed that the children who came from harder circumstances, the ones whose coats were thinner, whose lunches were sparse, those children sat closest to the stove without anyone assigning them to do so, and she let that arrangement stand and did not draw attention to it. Sam Rafferty had started staying after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Ostensibly, this was because he needed help with long division, which was true, but Evelyn suspected it was also because the schoolhouse was warmer than the feed merchant's storehouse where his father expected him to be by 4 o'clock, and she did not examine this too closely. She taught him long division, and then, when he had it, taught him fractions. And then because he was bored by fractions, she started teaching him basic geometry, drawing shapes on the blackboard, and asking him to tell her things about them. And the look on his face when he began to understand that mathematics was not a collection of rules to be memorized, but a set of tools for reasoning about the world. That look was the kind of thing she'd come to Wyoming for, even if she hadn't known how to articulate it that precisely before. "Why doesn't school teach you all of this at once?" he asked one Thursday, looking at a problem she'd drawn on the board. "Because most people find it easier to learn one piece at a time," she said. "I don't," he said. "No," she agreed. "You don't. That's something you should know about yourself." He looked at her with the wariness of a 9-year-old who has been told positive things about himself and learned not to trust them entirely. "My father says I think too much." She chose her words carefully. "Some people find a lot of thinking uncomfortable to be around," she said. "That doesn't mean the thinking is wrong." He turned this over. "Is that what happened to you? People finding you uncomfortable?" She almost laughed. "Frequently," she said. "And yet here I am." He thought about that for a moment and then went back to his problem, apparently satisfied. She walked home that evening in the early dark of December, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she thought about her father's last letter, which had arrived the previous week and had said, among other things, "You sound more settled, or maybe that's just what I want to hear. Are you eating enough?" The winters out there are real, Evelyn. Don't be foolish about the cold. She had written back, I am eating enough. I have learned about the cold. I am more settled. All of these things are true. She had not written the other true thing, which was that settled was not quite the right word. What she felt was more like the particular state of a person who has found the ground under her feet and is learning its unevenness and is not anymore surprised by it. That was different from settled. It was better in some ways, but it was also harder to explain. The difficulty came in mid-December, and it came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. She had expected resistance from parents about the curriculum. She knew the frontier had its own opinions about what children needed to learn, and that reading and arithmetic were generally accepted while other things required negotiation. She had expected some of the fathers to be skeptical about a 19-year-old woman running their children's education. She had prepared for both of these things, quietly, by being consistent and thorough and producing results that were visible and measurable. What she had not prepared for was the school board meeting. Calvin Dodd came to find her on a Wednesday morning, which was unusual. He typically stopped by in the late afternoon, and his manner was slightly off, the easy talkativeness compressed into something more cautious. Board meeting Friday, he said. They want you there. They want me there, she repeated. That's unusual. Well, he pulled at the back of his neck. Randall Cope has some concerns he wants to raise. She knew the name. Randall Cope owned the largest spread in the valley, about 12 miles east of Cedar Ridge, and had 3 children who were not among her students. She had sent the enrollment notice to every family with children in the district. The Cope children had not appeared. She had sent a follow-up. Nothing. She had not pushed further because there were limits to pushing and she had other things to manage, but she had noted it. What kind of concerns? She asked. Calvin looked at the ceiling briefly. He has opinions about the curriculum, about what you're teaching, about... He stopped. He'll say it himself Friday. I just wanted you to know it was coming so it wasn't a surprise. Is Nathan Reed going to be there? All 5 board members, yes. Good, she said. Calvin looked at her for a moment. You're not worried. I'm concerned, she corrected. Worried is what you do instead of preparing. I'm going to prepare. He left. She sat at her desk and thought for a while, and then she opened her gradebook and her attendance records and her lesson plans and began organizing them into a form that was suitable for presentation. The board met in the back room of the general store, which was the closest thing Cedar Ridge had to a civic space that could be heated. Barlow had set up a table and chairs, and 5 men sat on one side of it. Calvin Dodd, Nathan Reed, a rancher named George Ellison, who rarely spoke in public, the pastor of the town's small church, who served ex officio, and Randall Cope. She had seen Cope at a distance, but not met him. He was heavy-set, maybe 50, with the particular confidence of a man who had made money in a place where most people hadn't, and had concluded from this that his judgment was superior in most areas. He had a good coat and a bad habit of looking slightly past whoever was speaking to him, as though the truly important thing was always just behind their left shoulder. She sat across from them with her records on the table and her hands folded on top of them. Miss Hart, Cope said before anyone else had spoken. We appreciate you coming. Of course, she said. I'll be direct, he said, which people who are not naturally direct often say before being indirect. I have concerns about the school's direction, about what you're teaching these children. I'd like to hear them specifically, she said. He set his hands on the table. You're teaching things that aren't necessary for frontier life. Geometry. Geography beyond basic maps. Literature. He said the last word with a particular inflection, as though literature were a kind of mild vice. These children need reading, writing, arithmetic. They need practical skills. You're filling their heads with things that won't serve them. The room was quiet for a moment. Mr. Cope, she said. She kept her voice level. My attendance is currently at 15 students, up from 7 in the first week. 3 families specifically told me they enrolled their children after hearing that I was covering substantive material rather than basics only. She opened her gradebook and turned it to face them. These are my assessment results from last month. Every student who was struggling with reading in October is now reading at an improved level. Every student who had arithmetic gaps has made measurable progress. I can go through it family by family if that's useful. Jaspojpatsint Darayan. Cope glanced at the gradebook without apparent interest. Numbers aren't the point. What is the point? She asked. The point, he said, is that you're teaching my neighbor's daughter geography when she should be learning to manage a household. You're teaching Sam Rafferty about ancient civilizations when he should be learning to manage accounts. He leaned forward slightly. This is frontier country. People survive here by being practical. Your job is to prepare these children for the lives they're going to live, not to give them ideas about lives they can't have. She was aware of the 5 men watching her. She was aware of Calvin looking slightly pained, of George Ellison examining his hands, of Nathan being very still. Mr. Cope, she said, who told you what life you could have? And who told them? Silence. I ask because the children I teach, every one of them, lives in a territory that is changing. The railroad is extending, towns are growing, markets are connecting. The boy who can only manage accounts will lose business to the man who can read a contract. The girl who can only manage a household will be helpless if the household runs into trouble she can't navigate. She paused. I'm teaching them to think. That is the most practical thing I can do for them. Cope's expression had settled into the particular flatness of a man who is not convinced but is recalculating. You're very confident for someone 3 months into a job. I'm confident in what my records show, she said. If the board has specific objections to specific content, I'm glad to discuss those individually. If the concern is general, that education beyond basics is unnecessary, then I respectfully disagree, and I'm prepared to make that case as many times as necessary. A pause. Then Nathan said quietly and without particular emphasis, I'd like to see the assessment results. She slid the grade book across to him. He read it without rushing. The room was quiet except for the sound of him turning pages. 15 students, he said, not looking up. In a school that had 7 at opening and 0 for the year before that. He turned another page. Every student progressing. He set the book down and looked at Cope. Randall, what specifically do you want changed? Cope shifted in his seat. I want the curriculum reviewed. By who? By the board. That's us, Nathan said. We're looking at it now. He looked around the table. George Ellison, who had been examining his hands throughout, looked up. Seems fine to me, he said, in the tone of a man who has now said more in one meeting than he typically says in a month. Calvin said, I have no objections. The pastor, who had not spoken, said, The children seem engaged. That's the main thing. Cope looked at Nathan. Something passed between them that she couldn't entirely read. The particular communication of men who have known each other a long time and have a history she wasn't privy to. Then Cope sat back. I want this revisited in spring, he said. That's all I'm saying. That's reasonable, Nathan said. We'll revisit it in spring. He looked at Evelyn. Thank you for bringing your records, Miss Hart. That was well done. She gathered her papers and left. Standing outside in the cold, she breathed slowly for a moment and let her hands stop being quite so carefully still. She had not let them shake during the meeting. She let them shake a little now, just briefly, and then she walked back up the street toward the schoolhouse. She didn't see Nathan until the following week. He came by the schoolhouse on a Saturday when school was not in session, and she was there anyway because she had started spending Saturday mornings preparing the following week's lessons in the quiet of the empty room, which had the particular quality of a space that exists for one purpose and feels most itself when it's being used for that purpose, even alone. He knocked. She called out. He came in, looked at the paper spread on her desk, and sat in the chair beside it, the same chair he'd used before, without asking, which she had stopped noticing as presumptuous, and had started noticing as the absence of unnecessary ceremony. Cope won't push it further this year, he said. He made his point. He's satisfied it's on record. That's usually enough for him. Usually? She said. He's not a bad man, Nathan said. Then, that's not quite right either. He's not cruel. He's just decided he understands how things work, and he gets irritated when things don't conform to his understanding. He doesn't think women should be teaching beyond the basics, she said. No, Nathan said flatly. He doesn't. That's the actual thing underneath the curriculum argument. I know, she said. I knew it in the meeting. I just didn't address it directly because addressing it directly would have made it the center of the argument, and I wanted the results to be the center of the argument. He looked at her. That was the right call. I know, she said again. A silence settled, of the kind that was becoming familiar between them. Not empty, not uncomfortable, but carrying a certain weight of things not yet said. She organized a stack of papers to give her hand something to do. You were very calm in there, he said. I was not calm, she said. I was controlled. Those are different things. I know they are, he paused. It showed, though. The control. The board noticed. Did you notice? He considered the question with what seemed like genuine attention. I noticed you had your records ready before he finished his first sentence, he said. You'd prepared for exactly that argument. Calvin told me it was coming. Calvin told you there were concerns. You figured out what kind. He looked at the window. The north one. The one he'd caulked. That's not the same thing. She looked at him. The winter light was flat and gray through the windows, and it made his face look more angular, threw the old scar into relief. She thought about what it must have cost him to have that ranch. To build it from what she'd heard was not much. To make something deliberate out of a hard place without it looking deliberate. Why did you vote to hire me? She asked. And I mean the real reason, not the reason you told me before. He was quiet for a moment. I told you the real reason, he said. Your letter said the job was hard and you were still interested. That's what I responded to. But you could have found that in someone with more experience. Experience isn't always what it looks like, he said. I've met experienced people who were done learning. You weren't done learning. That letter was from someone still in the middle of figuring things out. I thought that was more useful than someone who'd already decided they knew how. She sat with that. You took a risk. I take calculated risks, he said. There's a difference. Is there always? His mouth moved slightly. No, he said. Not always. Took it. Winter came on properly in January, the way people had been warning her it would. The sky went white and stayed white, and the cold was no longer a temperature so much as a physical presence that pressed against every seal and joint of every structure in Cedar Ridge. She learned to bank the schoolhouse stove before she left each afternoon and arrive early enough each morning to have the room livable by the time the children arrived. She learned to read the particular shade of the northern sky that meant snow was building, and to watch for it through the classroom window and, when she saw it, to begin wrapping things up so the children could start for home before it hit. She lost 2 students in January. The Croft family, who had a homestead 10 miles out, pulled their children when the distance became genuinely dangerous on bad weather days. She wrote them a letter saying she understood and that she was working on ways to provide materials they could use at home. And she put together reading packets and arithmetic sheets and asked Calvin Dodd to pass them along when someone went that direction. Whether the children used them, she couldn't know. But she'd done what she could. She got one student back in late January that she hadn't expected. A girl named Martha Ellison, George Ellison's daughter, 14 years old and sullen about it, who arrived one Monday morning after her father had apparently decided, for reasons he did not explain to anyone, that she should be in school. Martha sat in the back row and looked at everything Evelyn did with the expression of someone who was determining whether the activity was worth the effort of actual attention. She was smart. Evelyn could see that in the first hour, and bored by the level of the material and too proud to show she was bored, which was its own complicated negotiation. After the first week, Evelyn kept her after school. You're bored, Evelyn said. Martha looked at her without expression. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Evelyn sat on the edge of her desk. How old are you? 14. Can you read above the level we're working at in class? A pause. Probably. Definitely or probably? Definitely, Martha said, with the precision of someone who doesn't like imprecision but also doesn't like admitting things. All right. Evelyn reached behind her and took a book from the shelf. Dickens' Great Expectations, which she'd brought from Illinois. Start at the beginning and see how far you get. Bring it back next Friday and tell me what you think. Martha looked at the book. That's not a school book. No, Evelyn agreed. It's better. Something shifted in the girl's face. A brief, involuntary softening that was gone almost immediately. She took the book. She didn't say thank you. She left. The following Friday, she returned it and said, without preamble, the ending is unsatisfying. Which version did you read? Evelyn asked. Martha frowned. There's more than one version. Dickens revised the ending after publication. The original is more honest, I think, but the published revision is more hopeful. Evelyn opened her desk drawer and took out a piece of paper on which she'd written out the two endings side by side. Tell me which you think is truer. Martha sat down in the nearest desk without being asked and read both versions. Evelyn marked papers while she read. It took about 20 minutes. Then Martha set the paper down. The first one, she said. The hopeful ending is too convenient. Why? Because people don't change that cleanly. Things don't resolve that neatly. She said this with the certainty of someone who has observed enough adult life to have formed firm opinions about it. The first ending is harder, but it's more like what actually happens. I think the same, Evelyn said. Though I understand why he changed it. He wanted to give people something they could hold on to. Martha was quiet for a moment. Can I have another book? Yes, Evelyn said. Come in Saturday morning. I'll find you something. Martha came Saturday morning, and Nathan was already there, sitting in his usual chair, going over something with Evelyn about the stovepipe. There had been a creak in the joint she'd reported, and he'd come to look at it. Martha came in, saw him, and stopped in the doorway. Martha, Nathan said. He seemed unsurprised to see her. Mr. Reed. She looked between the two of them with the sharp assessment of a 14-year-old who notices things. Come in, Evelyn said. We were just finishing. She looked at Nathan. The joint's fine, he said. I'll check it again in March when the thaw starts. He stood, picked up his hat. Miss Hart? A nod. Martha. He left. Martha watched him go and then looked at Evelyn with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. What? Evelyn said. Nothing, Martha said. Evelyn decided not to pursue it. She took 3 books from the shelf and set them on the desk and let Martha choose. February was the month she came closest to breaking. Not from the cold, though the cold was worse than anything she had previously experienced. Not from the isolation, which had settled into something she'd largely made peace with. It was the letter from the Decatur School Board, which arrived the second week of February and informed her that a position had opened for the following autumn. A town school, 30 students, good salary, established curriculum. A situation that would be, the letter said with the particular careful kindness of people offering you something they think you need, considerably more suitable for a young woman of her background and experience. She read the letter twice and then set it face down on her desk and taught her afternoon class. She did not write back that day. She taught, she walked home, she ate supper, she sat by the smoking stove in her room above the general store and thought about what she was being offered. It was not nothing. A town school in Illinois was not nothing. The salary was better. The students were more numerous. The building, described in the letter, was a real school with 2 rooms and a proper library. She thought about Sam Rafferty, who had started doing geometry for pleasure, who had shown her last week that he'd figured out something about angles that she hadn't taught him, that he'd reasoned out on his own with a stick in the snow behind his father's storehouse. She thought about Martha Ellison, who had read 4 books in 3 weeks and was now arguing with Evelyn about the relative merits of omniscient versus close third-person narration, which was not a conversation Evelyn had expected to have with a 14-year-old frontier girl, and which delighted her. She thought about Lucy Marsh, who had stopped asking if Evelyn was going to leave. She thought about the north window, caulked tight against the cold. She did not think about that last thing. Or she thought about it briefly and then deliberately put it aside, because it was not relevant, or she was not ready for it to be relevant, and she was not entirely certain which of those 2 things was true. She wrote back to the Decatur School Board. She thanked them for the offer and declined. She put the letter in the outgoing mail before she could think about it further, and then she went to school and taught arithmetic and read Treasure Island to her younger students and felt the ground under her feet, uneven as it was, hold. She told Nathan about the letter one Saturday in late February. She didn't know, afterward, why she'd told him. It had not been a decision so much as the words coming out when they hadn't been anticipated. He was in his usual chair, she was at her desk, they were having one of their Saturday conversations that had settled into something she looked forward to without examining too closely. They had been talking about the spring thaw and what it would mean for the road to the Croft homestead when she said, interrupting herself mid-sentence, I got a letter from a school board in Illinois last month, offering me a position. He looked at her. He did not say anything. I declined, she said. The room was quiet. Wind moved against the north window. "Why?" he asked. Just that. She thought about Sam's angles in the snow, about Martha and the Dickens endings, about Lucy Marsh not asking anymore. "Because I started something here," she said, "and I don't leave things half finished." He was quiet for a moment longer than usual. "That's one reason," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That's one reason." Neither of them said anything else about it. Outside, the February wind moved across the Wyoming flats and pressed against the walls of the schoolhouse, and inside the stove burned steady, and between them sat something that had no name yet, but that both of them could feel, patient and inconvenient and not going anywhere. The thaw was still 6 weeks off, but it was coming. Everything eventually came. The thaw came in the second week of March, which was earlier than most people expected and later than everyone needed. The road to the Croft homestead opened up enough that Evelyn was able to send fresh reading materials with a rancher named Hobbs, who passed that direction twice a month, and she got a letter back from Margaret Croft, the mother, not the children, saying that both boys had been working through the packets, and that the older one, Daniel, had apparently memorized the entire multiplication table and was now teaching it to the younger one, which was not something she had expected from a child who had previously shown no enthusiasm for arithmetic whatsoever. Evelyn read that letter at her desk on a Friday afternoon and felt a particular kind of satisfaction that was quiet and complete and didn't require anyone else to witness it. March brought other things, too. The community was shifting around her in ways she was only beginning to map. Families who had been watchful were becoming familiar, the particular wariness of people who protect their trust carefully giving way, slowly, to something more open. She was invited to supper at the Garfields a second time and then a third. Ida Marsh started stopping by the schoolhouse on Tuesday afternoons, officially to drop off a piece of sewing she did in the back room during the children's reading hour. Actually, Evelyn understood, because she liked the company and because Ida was a woman who had been in Cedar Ridge long enough to know everyone, and was therefore occasionally hungry for a conversation with someone who had thoughts she hadn't already heard. She and Nathan settled into something that neither of them named. He came to the schoolhouse most Saturdays. Sometimes there was a practical reason. Something to check, something to fix. And sometimes there wasn't, and on those occasions he arrived with no stated purpose and sat in his chair and they talked for an hour or two, and then he left. The conversations ranged widely. He knew the land and the cattle business and the particular economics of frontier ranching in a way that she found, unexpectedly, interesting. Not because she'd intended to be interested in cattle, but because listening to him describe how he thought about things revealed a kind of intelligence that was very specific and very practical and went deep. She talked about the school, about the children, about the things she was reading and thinking. He listened. He was, she had come to understand, a careful listener. Not the kind who was waiting for you to finish so he could respond, but the kind who actually took things in and turned them over before he said anything. She learned pieces of him slowly, the way you learn terrain by crossing it repeatedly in different weather. The ranch had been his life's deliberate work, built from the ground up with money he'd saved over 8 years of working other men's cattle. He had one brother back east in Pennsylvania, whom he corresponded with infrequently. There had been a woman years ago before he came to Wyoming. He mentioned this once, briefly, in the context of something else, and did not expand on it, and she did not ask. Whatever that had been, it had left a particular kind of caution behind it, the kind you see in people who have learned that wanting something and having it are two things that don't automatically follow from each other. She recognized that caution because she had a version of it herself. The thing that almost derailed everything came from the east in late March, carried by a man named Deacon Pryor. She heard the name before she met him. Calvin Dodd mentioned it first. Deacon Pryor's come into town buying up land options, with the particular studied casualness of a man relaying information he considers significant. Then Ida mentioned it, less casually. There's a man out of Cheyenne here, Evelyn, and people are talking. Then, on a Friday morning, 3 of her students didn't come to school because their fathers had gone to a meeting in the saloon, which was not where Cedar Ridge residents typically held meetings, but was apparently where Pryor had chosen to host this one. She found out the substance of it from Nathan, that same Saturday. He came in without his usual steadiness. It was not obvious. He sat in his chair, he held himself the same way, but she had learned to read small things about him, and the small things were different. The way he set his hat on the desk too precisely. The way he looked at the window rather than at her for the first 10 seconds. "Tell me about Pryor," she said, before he'd said anything. He looked at her. "Who told you?" "Everyone," she folded her hands. "Calvin, Ida, the fact that 3 of my students weren't in school yesterday because their fathers were at a meeting. What is he?" Nathan took a breath, slow and deliberate. "Land speculator, most likely. He's out of Cheyenne, well-dressed, good talker. He came into town Wednesday with a surveyor's assistant and a briefcase full of papers." He paused. "He's been telling people that the territorial government is planning a rail spur through the valley." She frowned. "Is it true?" "No," Nathan said. "Or rather, there was a proposal 2 years ago that went nowhere. The main line went north of here. Pryor is representing the proposal as though it's current and proceeding, when by everything I can find out, it's dead." "Why would he do that?" "Because if people believe a rail spur is coming, the land in its projected path becomes worth considerably more than it currently is. He's been buying options, the right to purchase land at a fixed price within a set period, from homesteaders who think they're getting ahead of something. They agree now to sell to him later at a price that seems good, but would be far below the value if the rail actually came." He looked at his hands. "And if the rail doesn't come, which it won't, he's out only the cost of the options, and he's already moved on to the next valley." "And the homesteaders?" "They've agreed to terms that may lock them out of selling to anyone else in the interim. Depending on what he's actually put in the papers, which I haven't seen, they could end up with very little recourse." He paused. 3 families signed options at that meeting Friday. She sat with this for a moment. "Which families?" He told her. She knew all 3. The Raffertys were one of them. "Does Henry Rafferty understand what he signed?" she asked. "Henry Rafferty is a man who doesn't like to appear uncertain," Nathan said carefully, "which is a disadvantage when someone is counting on you to sign before you've thought it through." She thought about Sam Rafferty in her schoolroom on Thursday afternoons, reasoning through geometry problems with the focused pleasure of a person who had just discovered what his mind could do. She thought about what it would mean for that family if the land deal went wrong. "What are you going to do?" she asked Nathan. "I've written to a solicitor in Cheyenne. I want to see the actual land option documents before I say anything publicly, because if I'm wrong about what's in them, I'll have done more damage than Pryor." He looked at her steadily. "I need 3 weeks, probably, maybe 4. Can you get those documents?" "I'm working on it." He paused. "Pryor's planning another meeting, 2nd week of April, more families." "Then you have until the 2nd week of April," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "Is your land in this? Your ranch?" "He came to see me on Thursday," Nathan said. "I told him I wasn't interested. He was polite about it." A pause. "He'll come back." "Will you stay not interested?" He looked at her as though the question was slightly unnecessary. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. There was a silence. Outside, the March wind was still cold, but carrying something different in it now. Not the flat, killing cold of January, but something that moved rather than pressed. The world was beginning its slow argument against winter. "You should know," Nathan said, "that Cope is involved." She stilled. "How involved?" "Pryor spent 2 hours at Cope's ranch Thursday night. I don't know what passed between them. Cope's land is east of the projected spur path, so he has nothing to sell into the scheme. But Cope has influence over how people in this valley think." He said this without drama. "If Cope starts speaking well of Pryor's proposal, more people will believe it." She thought about the school board meeting in December, about Cope's flat confidence in his own understanding of how things worked. "Can Cope be reasoned with?" she asked. "Sometimes," Nathan said, "if you can show him the reasoning matters to his own interests." He paused. "He's not dishonest. He just has a comfortable life and doesn't like things that threaten its comfort, and sometimes that makes him make choices he'd be embarrassed by if he saw them clearly." "There's something almost sympathetic about that," she said, without quite meaning it as a compliment. "Most people's flaws are sympathetic if you look at them from close enough," Nathan said, and something in the way he said it made her think he was speaking from more than general observation. Well, she did not have a role in the prior situation exactly. It was not her affair. She was the school teacher, and the land dealings of Cedar Ridge were not her domain, and had not been made her domain by anyone. But Martha Ellison came to school on Monday with a quiet that was wrong, and Evelyn noticed it by the second hour and kept her in at lunch. "What happened?" she asked. Martha looked out the window. "My father and Mr. Pryor had a long conversation yesterday." Evelyn was careful. And my father was talking about selling a land option, the East Pasture. He said it was a guaranteed return, that the rail was coming through. She turned to look at Evelyn, and her expression was the particular complicated thing of someone who has reasoned their way to a conclusion they're not sure they're supposed to have. "But it doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like the kind of thing that's as certain as he says." "What makes you think that?" Evelyn asked. "Because things that are actually certain don't need to be explained that many times," Martha said. "He explained it to my mother 4 times at supper. If it were actually obvious, he'd have only had to say it once." Evelyn looked at the girl across the desk. 14 years old, watching the adults around her with the sharp and somewhat sorrowful intelligence of someone who has already learned that intelligence doesn't protect you from the choices of people you depend on. "What do you think you should do?" Evelyn asked. Martha was quiet for a moment. "I think someone should look at the actual papers before he signs anything. Can you get him to wait?" "My mother might be able to." She paused. If she had a reason, something specific. Evelyn chose her next words carefully. "There are people in this town who are looking into Mr. Pryor's proposal and what it actually contains. I believe that information will be available within a few weeks. If your mother could find a reason to ask your father to wait until he's seen what other people in the valley are thinking, without saying why, that might buy the time needed." Martha looked at her. "You know something." "I know that careful is better than fast," Evelyn said, "and that your instinct, that things which are certain don't need to be explained 4 times, is worth trusting." Martha absorbed this. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone committing something to memory. "You're not going to tell me more than that?" "No," Evelyn said. "Not yet. But I need you to trust me the same way I'm trusting you." Martha nodded once, with the seriousness of someone older. "All right," she said. She went home that afternoon, and Evelyn had no way of knowing what conversation followed between Martha and her mother, and between her mother and George Ellison. But by Wednesday, George Ellison had not signed any land option document, and Pryor, when she saw him crossing the main street on Thursday, the well-dressed man from Cheyenne, with the surveyor's assistant and the briefcase, looked like a man who was on a schedule and was not happy about delays. April came wet and unpredictable, as people had warned her it would. The thaw made the roads unreliable, and the schoolhouse floor, despite the roof repair, showed a small leak over the northwest corner that dripped steadily when the rain was heavy. She put a bucket there and wrapped the affected books in oilcloth and kept teaching, and after the 3rd day of rain, Nathan appeared at the door with 2 lengths of tar paper and repaired the leak himself on a Saturday morning while she taught a reading session, the sound of him moving on the roof audible overhead. Sam Rafferty, who had exceptional ears, looked at the ceiling during the lesson. "Is someone on the roof?" he asked. "Mr. Reed is fixing a leak," Evelyn said. Sam considered this. "My father says Mr. Reed is causing trouble." The room went very still in the way that rooms with children go still when something adult and significant is said. "What kind of trouble?" Lucy Marsh asked with the directness of a 9-year-old. "He doesn't want people to sell their land," Sam said, still looking at the ceiling. "My father signed a paper and Mr. Reed told him he should think about it first, and my father didn't like that." Evelyn waited a moment. "Sam," she said, "what do you think?" He looked at her. A 9-year-old, and the question landed visibly. She could see him deciding whether to answer honestly or carefully, and she could see the moment he decided that she would notice either way. "I think Mr. Reed is usually right about things," Sam said. "My father doesn't like that either." From overhead came the sound of Nathan moving across the roof, steady and deliberate, the way he did everything. Evelyn looked at the book open on her desk. "Back to chapter 9, she said. "Reread the last 2 pages and tell me what Jim Hawkins should have done differently." The children returned to their books. And from overhead, the sound of the work continued, and the drip into the bucket slowed, and then stopped. Nathan got the documents. He came to the schoolhouse on the second Saturday in April, the day before Pryor's second meeting, with a leather folder and the expression of a man who has confirmed what he suspected and doesn't find the confirmation satisfying. The option agreements give Pryor a 30-day exclusive purchase right for a price locked at current land valuation, he said, setting the folder on her desk. The families can't sell to anyone else in that window, and if the promised rail survey doesn't happen, which it won't, the option simply lapses. No money changes hands, and Pryor moves on. So they lose nothing, she said, reading over the page he'd opened. They lose 30 days in which they could have sold to someone who actually wanted to buy. But more importantly, he turned to another page. The option agreement contains this clause. He pointed. She read it. It took her a moment to follow the language, which was deliberately constructed to require following. This says that if the signatory speaks publicly against the terms of the option or the associated rail proposal to third parties, the option holder may claim damages. Yes, he can silence them from talking about it. Legally questionable, Nathan said. Probably wouldn't stand up. But most of these families don't have the money to find out whether it would stand up, so it functions as a silencing clause regardless. She sat back in her chair. He's not just taking land options. He's buying quiet. He's been doing it in other valleys, Nathan said. That's what my solicitor found. 3 other settlements in the territory in the past 2 years. Same pattern. He doesn't need it to work completely. He needs enough of it to work to cover his costs and show profit. And then he's gone. What will you do tomorrow? I'll be at the meeting, he said, with copies of these documents and the solicitor's analysis of the silencing clause. I'll make the argument publicly, in front of everyone who's there, including people who haven't signed yet. He paused. Cope will be there. I don't know which side he'll land on. He signed his own name to nothing, she said, so he has no financial stake in defending Pryor. He only has a social stake in not being seen to have been wrong. Nathan looked at her. Yes, he said. Then show him the documents before the meeting. Give him the chance to see it privately first, so that when you raise it publicly, he can agree with you without it looking like he's reversing himself. A pause. That would require me to go to Cope's ranch this evening. Yes, she said. Cope and I haven't... He stopped. We don't have an easy history. She had gathered this over the months, in pieces, without Nathan ever saying it directly. Something about land, about a boundary dispute 3 years ago, about a fence line in a dry creek and 2 men who had both believed they were right and neither had been willing to fold first. It had resolved after a fashion, but things that resolve like that leave marks. I know, she said. That's probably why it matters that it's you who goes. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the April wind moved through the new grass on the slope behind the schoolhouse. She could hear it, a sound different from winter wind, softer at the edges. You're very good at this, he said. Working out what will actually move people. I teach children, she said. You have to know what actually moves people. It's more than that, he said. She looked at him. He was not a man who gave out statements like that carelessly, and they both knew it, and the knowing sat between them for a moment before she looked back at the documents. Go to Cope's tonight, she said. Show him what you have. Let him choose. He went. She did not know until the following Monday what had happened at Pryor's second meeting, because she had no good reason to attend herself and Calvin Dodd was not there either, and had to reconstruct it from secondary accounts. What she learned was this. Nathan had arrived with his folder of documents and his solicitor's analysis and had laid it out without drama for the assembled room. Pryor had objected and made a counter-argument that was, by most accounts, smooth and well-constructed and largely unconvincing, because Nathan had already walked Randall Cope through the documents the previous evening, and Cope had stood up in that meeting and said, in front of everyone, that he had reviewed the materials and believed the concerns were legitimate. That was the weight of it. Not what was said, but who said it. Pryor left Cedar Ridge 3 days later. 2 of the 3 families who had signed options sent word through Calvin that they wanted to talk to Nathan about whether the agreements could be unwound, and Nathan met with both of them on consecutive evenings at their kitchen tables and explained clearly what he understood their options to be, and referred them to the solicitor in Cheyenne for the actual legal work. Henry Rafferty was the 3rd family. He did not reach out. She was walking home from the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after the meeting, when she nearly crossed paths with Nathan coming out of the feed merchants. He fell into step beside her in the way he sometimes did now, without it being planned. They were heading in the same direction, and the street was quiet, and it was simply natural, the way things become natural when they've been done enough times that they stop requiring justification. "Did you hear about Rafferty?" he said. "No," she said. "What happened?" He went to the solicitor himself, paid for the consultation out of his own pocket, and had the option agreement reviewed. It'll lapse on its own at the end of the 30-day window without financial consequence. He paused. "He didn't ask me for help." She thought about that. "He did it himself," she said. "Yes, that matters," she said. "For him, that he did it himself." Nathan nodded slowly. "I wouldn't have thought of it that way," he said. "But yes, I think you're right." They walked another half block. The afternoon light was the particular amber of April in Wyoming, long and warm-toned, catching the dust on the street and turning it to something almost pleasant. "Sam's been different this week," she said. "Different how?" "Easier. Not lighter exactly, but like something he was carrying got a little smaller." She looked at the street ahead. Children carry the weight of what's happening to their parents. They're carrying it all the time, and most of the time you can't do anything about the source of it. You can only try to make the school a place that puts it down for a while. He was quiet for a moment. "You do that," he said. "The school does that." "Some days better than others," she said. They had reached the point where their paths diverged. Her turn led to the general store. His continued north. He stopped. She stopped. The evening was coming in at the edges of the sky, the first cool fingers of it after a warm afternoon, and somewhere up the street a door closed and a child's voice rose briefly and fell. "Evelyn?" he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She was aware of this in the immediate and also in the way that changes the shape of something retrospectively, so that the past looks slightly different from where you're standing. She looked at him. His hat was in his hand. He'd taken it off, she hadn't noticed when. He was looking at her with the particular directness of someone who has spent a long time being careful and has decided to stop being careful about one specific thing. "I would like—" He stopped, started again. "I'd like to take you to supper, in town. Not a practical reason, just supper." She looked at him for a moment. She was aware of the street, of windows, of the fact that Cedar Ridge was a small town, and that this moment was not a private one, and that Nathan Reed was a man who understood that and was standing here anyway. "Yes," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not relief, exactly. More like a thing that had been held carefully for a long time being set down. "Saturday?" he said. "Saturday," she agreed. He put his hat back on. "I'll come by at 6. "I'll be ready," she said. He nodded and walked on. She watched him go for a moment and then turned toward the general store, and she was aware of the warmth of the April evening, of the smell of new grass and mud, of a bird somewhere making a sound she didn't know the name of. Cedar Ridge was still small, and the winter was not that far behind, and there was still, she knew, a great deal of hard ahead. But the ground was under her feet, and she knew its unevenness now, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, most of what it took. The supper was at the only proper eating establishment in Cedar Ridge, which was a room off the back of Mrs. Peterman's house that she opened for meals on certain evenings, with 4 tables and a menu that changed based on what she had available, which that Saturday was roast chicken and boiled potatoes and a dried apple pie that was considerably better than it had any reason to be. Nathan arrived at 6, as he'd said. He had made some effort with his appearance. The coat was brushed, the hat was the better one. But it was not the kind of effort that announced itself, which she appreciated. She had made effort too, though limited by the contents of 2 suitcases, and Ida had come by in the afternoon and insisted on doing her hair in a way that Evelyn found slightly more elaborate than warranted and Ida found obviously necessary. They walked to Mrs. Peterman's. The evening was cool and clear. He did not offer his arm, and she did not expect him to. And the absence of that particular formal gesture made the walk feel more honest than it might have otherwise. They talked through supper with the ease of people who have already covered a great deal of ground together and don't need to perform the introductory versions of themselves. He told her more about the ranch, the cattle numbers he was working toward, the water source that would determine whether the east pasture was usable in a dry year, the particular decisions that had been hard and why. She told him about her plans for the school in the coming year, about a reader she'd written to a publisher in Chicago to request, about the possibility of a second-grade level if enrollment continued to grow. They talked about books. He had more of them than she'd initially noticed on the shelf at the ranch, and he'd read them with the same deliberateness he applied to everything. Not casually, but with attention. He walked her back to the general store at 8:30. At the door he stopped and looked at her with that particular directness that she had come to understand was his version of openness. "This was good," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was." "I'd like to do it again," he said. "I'd like that too," she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything more. He put his hat on against the evening cold and walked back up the street, and she stood at the door for a moment watching him go, aware of the town around her, the lamplight in windows, the sound of the saloon a block down, the Wyoming dark overhead, and of the feeling that she was, increasingly, in the right place. Not a perfect place, not an easy place, but the right one. She went inside and climbed the stairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a moment and thought, "This is not what I expected." And then she thought, "No, but it might be better." The storm came 2 weeks later. She should not have been caught in it. That was the honest accounting of it. She should not have been where she was, and she knew the sky well enough by then to have read the warning signs if she'd been paying the right kind of attention. But she had gone to the Croft homestead. It had been planned for a week, a proper visit this time, with the roads finally passable, to deliver the spring reading materials in person and to meet Daniel Croft, who had taught his younger brother the multiplication table, and whose mother had written 3 letters by now that suggested a boy worth meeting. She'd arranged it with Mrs. Croft by correspondence and had borrowed a horse from the livery and had set out on a morning that was bright and sharp with high thin cloud, which, in Wyoming, she had not yet fully learned, sometimes meant weather that could turn in an afternoon. She stayed too long at the Croft homestead because Daniel turned out to be exactly what his mother's letters had suggested, and then more. A 12-year-old with a gift for pattern recognition that manifested in both mathematics and language, who had been educating himself out of the few books available to him with a hungry thoroughness that made her feel, simultaneously, the joy of what she could offer him and the guilt of how long he'd gone without it. They talked for 2 hours. She left later than she'd intended. She was 6 miles from Cedar Ridge when the sky changed. It came from the northwest, moving faster than it should have in that season. A late April storm of the kind that the territory could still produce, cold air from the mountains meeting warming plains air and making something brutal out of the meeting. The cloud bank was gray-green at its lower edge, the particular color that meant serious business, and the wind shifted direction suddenly, backing around to the north with a cold that was wrong for April, wrong in a January way. She pushed the horse faster. The horse was willing but not fast, a solid livery animal without the particular responsive energy of a well-matched riding horse. The first snow hit when she was maybe 3 miles out. Not heavy, not yet, but driven hard by the wind, stinging her face and filling the air between her and the road ahead, so that the familiar landscape became strange. She knew, with the clarity of someone whose fear has crystallized into pure assessment, that she was not going to make it back to Cedar Ridge before the storm hit fully. The question was what she was going to do about that. There was a structure off the road. She had passed it before, a disused line shack that belonged to someone's grazing allotment, possibly Cope's, possibly one of the smaller ranchers east of town. It was not much. It might not be weather tight, but it was something with walls, and the alternative was the open road with visibility dropping by the minute. She turned the horse off the road and rode for it. She found it by luck as much as direction. The snow was coming sideways now, the light gone flat, and distances were wrong in that way they become in a whiteout. The shack appeared out of the white with the sudden quality of things seen in bad visibility, closer than expected and to her left. She dismounted before the horse fully stopped, her boots hitting ground that was already snow-covered, and got the horse under the overhang on the south side of the structure where there was a rusted iron ring in the post. She tied the horse and got the door of the shack open. It took 3 tries against the wind and got inside. It was cold. The wind came through gaps in the boards, and there was no stove, only an old fire ring in the dirt floor with a rusted grate. There was a pile of old wood in the corner, dry enough to be possible. She had matches in her coat pocket. She had started carrying them always, a habit she'd developed in winter. And she had the wool blanket rolled behind the saddle, which she retrieved from the horse through the door and then pushed the door shut and latched it. She got a fire going in the ring on the fourth match. It was small and smoky, and she had to feed it carefully, but it caught, and it held, and the shack's interior, which was maybe 10 by 12 feet, began incrementally to be warmer than outside. Then she sat on the floor beside the fire and listened to the storm, and thought about her situation, which was cold and not comfortable, and also not yet, genuinely dangerous. She had fire, she had a blanket, she had the half loaf of bread she'd brought for the Croft visit and hadn't finished. She could stay here until it eased. What she could not do was tell anyone where she was. Outside, the storm hit fully. She could hear it in the boards, in the roof, a sound that was not quite like anything else, the full force of Wyoming weather coming down. And it was only an April storm, but it did not feel minor, crouched beside a small fire in a shack she'd found by luck, while the world outside went white and furious. And without her. She fed the fire. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. She waited. She thought about Cedar Ridge, about the schoolhouse, about the children who would arrive Monday morning, about Nathan. She thought about the supper at Mrs. Peterman's, about the walk there and back, about the particular quality of the silence that had sat between them at the door. Not empty, not waiting, but full of something that had been built over months, one Saturday morning at a time. Outside, the storm showed no interest in any of this. It moved across the Wyoming plain with the impersonal fury of weather that has no business with human schedules or human feelings. And the shack shuddered in it, and the fire burned small and steady, and Evelyn Hart pulled the blanket tighter and did not let herself think about anything other than keeping the fire going, because that was what was necessary, and she had learned to stay with what was necessary. The wind did not stop. The night came in without sunset, just a steady darkening of the white, and she added the last of the dry wood to the fire and calculated what was left and what she needed and tried to determine whether there was more wood anywhere in the shack that she'd missed. She had, in fact, missed some. A few lengths pushed against the far wall under the lowest board, half covered in old straw. She added them to her pile and returned to the fire and sat. The storm howled. And somewhere out in it, though she didn't know this yet, wouldn't know it until later, a horse was moving through the white, carrying a man who had come to find her, riding directly into the full face of the storm because she was in it, and he was not the kind of person who could know that and stay inside. He had known something was wrong before the storm hit fully. It was not intuition, or nothing so mysterious as that. It was the simple accumulation of details that didn't fit. He had seen Evelyn at the schoolhouse Friday morning when he'd stopped to drop off a length of rope she'd asked about for the children's outdoor equipment, and she'd mentioned the Croft visit, casually, the way you mention plans to someone who has become part of the regular texture of your days. He had noted the sky at noon and not liked what it was doing, and he had thought about the Croft homestead, 10 miles out, road running across open plain with nothing between it and the northwest. And he had thought about the fact that the livery horse she'd borrowed was a solid animal, but not a fast one. By 2 o'clock, the storm had started. By 3, it was serious. By 4, Nathan was saddled and moving. Mrs. Alcott had been at the ranch that day and had watched him prepare with the expression of a woman who has learned over 6 years when arguing is useful and when it isn't. "You'll take the spare blankets," she said, not as a question, "and the flask, and you'll not do anything stupid." She said the last part while handing him both blankets, which made the instruction somewhat rhetorical. "I'll be careful," he said. "That's not the same as not doing anything stupid," she said, "but it'll have to do." He rode out into it. The wind was coming hard from the northwest, and the snow was the fine, driving kind that gets into every gap, between collar and neck, between glove and sleeve, and the visibility was poor and getting worse. He kept the horse moving at a pace that was faster than careful and slower than reckless, which was the only pace available given what was in front of him. He knew the road to the Croft homestead. He had ridden it in various conditions over 5 years. He knew where it bent and where it straightened and where the ground went soft near the creek crossing and where the old fence lines ran. He used that knowledge now to hold his direction when the visible landmarks disappeared into white. He was looking for tracks, but the snow was covering them fast. He He was looking for any deviation from the road, any place where a horse and rider had turned off. He almost missed it. The turnoff was visible only as a slight depression in the snow, already running northwest off the main road toward the Cope grazing land. He wouldn't have caught it at all, except that his horse shifted at the junction, the animal picking up something. A scent, maybe, carried sideways by the wind, and that slight movement made him look down at exactly the right moment. He turned off the road and followed what he could see of the tracks, and then what he could no longer see of them, riding by the logic of the land. If someone was looking for shelter and turning off here, the line shack was the only structure within reasonable distance. He had been in that shack twice. He remembered its position relative to the road, the rusted ring on the post, the old fire ring inside. He found it 20 minutes later. The horse tied under the overhang told him what he needed to know before he got the door open. She heard the horse before she heard him. The sound of it arriving cut through the storm noise, and she was on her feet and at the door before she'd finished deciding to move. And when she opened it, the wind drove snow into the shack in a sudden cold rush, and Nathan was standing in it, snow-covered, his horse behind him, his expression doing the particular thing she'd come to read as his version of relief. "You're all right," he said, not a question, more like something he was confirming for himself. "I'm all right," she said. "Come in, get out of the wind." He tied his horse beside hers under the overhang and came inside, and she pulled the door closed against the storm. The shack was dim and small, and the fire had burned down to coals while she'd been at the door, and she knelt and fed it from the remaining wood while he stood with snow melting off his coat and dripping onto the dirt floor. "You came out in this," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the fact of it, which was still landing. "Yes," he said. "How did you find the tracks? They must have been nearly gone." "They were. My horse caught something at the junction." He crouched beside the fire, holding his hands out. They were stiff. She could see it in the way he moved them, the particular careful flex of someone whose fingers are not entirely responding. "How long have you been here?" "Since about 4, I think. Maybe earlier." She looked at him. "Your hands. They're all right." "They're not." She picked up the blanket from the floor, the one she'd been using, and without quite deciding to, she took both his hands between hers and folded the blanket around them and held them there. He went very still. Not the kind of still that is discomfort, the other kind. "The fire's going to need more wood in an hour," she said, conversationally, as though this were a normal situation. "There's more on the horse," he said. "I packed some. I'll get it when the wind drops a little." "Does it drop?" "April storms usually blow through faster than winter ones, 4 or 5 hours at most." She was still holding his hands in the blanket. She became aware of this and did not do anything about it. He became aware of her awareness and also did not do anything about it. Outside, the storm presented the full argument against this entire situation, and neither of them attended to it. "I should have watched the sky more carefully," she said. "Yes," he said. "You should have." She looked at him. "Most people would say something reassuring there. Most people weren't riding through that storm just now," he said. There was no anger in it, just the plainness of his accounting of things, which she had stopped finding harsh a long time ago and started finding, the only word for it, honest. "I'm sorry you had to come out," she said. "I'm not," he said. And then, a beat later, quieter. "I need you to know that. I'm not sorry." She looked at his face. Snow was still melting at his hairline and along his jaw, and the scar caught the firelight, and he was looking at her with the kind of directness that doesn't happen by accident, that is chosen deliberately by someone who has decided to stop avoiding a thing. She didn't look away. "I know," she said. The fire cracked. Outside, the storm ran hard against the boards, and the little shack held, and they stayed where they were beside the fire with the blanket between their hands, and something that had been building since an October night at a dark train station settled into place between them with the quiet finality of something that is found where it belongs. They talked for most of the night, not about the important thing, not directly. That was not how either of them worked, and they both understood this about themselves and each other well enough not to try. They talked around it and alongside it and through it, the way you sometimes can only say the large thing by saying everything adjacent to it first. He told her about the woman before Wyoming. Her name had been Clara, the same name as his mare, which was not a coincidence, which he acknowledged with a brevity that suggested he'd made a certain peace with the coincidence, but still found it something. They had been together for 3 years in Pennsylvania, and he had intended to marry her, and she had ultimately married a man who had a house already built and a business established, and who did not have, as Nathan had then had, a plan for a ranch in a territory most people back east couldn't locate on a map. He told this without self-pity and without villainizing anyone involved. She wasn't wrong, he said. He could give her things I couldn't yet. I understood that. What I didn't understand for a long time was why I was so certain the ranch mattered more than adjusting the plan. He looked at the fire. It wasn't stubbornness. It was more like, I knew if I didn't build it myself from the start, I'd always be living in something someone else built, and I couldn't make that work in my head. Was mal, yes. Did you make the right choice? She asked. I made a choice that was right for who I was, he said. I'm not sure those are always the same thing. He paused. I spent a long time after that not making the other kind of choice, the personal kind. It seemed safer. And then, she said. He looked at her. And then a train left someone at a dark station in October. She was quiet for a moment. I wasn't looking for this, she said. I want to be honest about that. I came here for the school. That was the whole of my intention. I know, he said. I wasn't looking for it either. But here it is, she said. Here it is, he agreed. She shifted on the floor, pulling the blanket around her shoulders more fully. The fire was lower now, and she reached for the last of the wood and added it carefully. My father is going to have a great deal to say, she said. What kind of things? He'll want to know everything about you. Your land, your income, your intentions, your history. He's thorough. It won't be comfortable. She paused. He's a good man. He's just very thorough. I can handle thorough, Nathan said. You haven't met my father. Something moved in his face that was the nearest thing to amusement she'd seen from him. No, he said. But I've spent the winter on a school board with Randall Cope, so I have experience with people who have strong opinions and need to arrive at their own conclusions. She laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of her, and it was strange and good to hear it in that cold and battered little shack with the storm outside. He smiled at the sound of it, a real smile, the kind she'd seen only rarely, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing underneath all the carefulness. I think, she said when the laugh had passed, that if you're going to have a conversation with my father, you should probably have a conversation with me first. He looked at her steadily. What kind of conversation? The specific kind, she said, the kind where you say exactly what you mean without the practical framing. A silence. The wind pressed against the boards and the fire breathed low and orange between them. I love you, he said, simple, direct, without performance. I have for a while. I didn't say it because I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it, and I wasn't sure I was ready to say it in a way that was fair to you. I'm saying it now because we're here, and the storm made the timing for me, and I'd rather say it in a line shack in a blizzard than spend another month not saying it. She looked at him for a long moment. I love you too, she said. For what it's worth, I didn't know it as a named thing until fairly recently. But it's been true longer than I knew it was. He nodded, slowly. Nothing about his expression was excessive. He did not reach for her or make any large gesture. He simply sat there with the fact of it, and she sat with it too, and that was exactly right for who they were. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. Outside, the storm began, very slightly, to ease. They rode back in the early morning when the sky had gone from black to the particular gray that precedes dawn, and the wind had dropped to something manageable. The snow was 6 inches on the flat, deeper in the drifts, and the road was not clearly visible, but was findable. He knew the route, and she followed his lead, and they rode in a silence that was companionable rather than empty, the horses moving steady and patient through the white world. Cedar Ridge appeared as lights in the pre-dawn gray. By the time they reached the livery and returned both horses, the sky was going amber at the east edge, and the town was beginning its early morning sounds. Smoke rising from chimneys, the distant sound of the smithy's door. He walked her to the door of the general store. The street was empty. Above, Barlow's lamp was not yet lit. Sleep, Nathan said. I will. She looked at him. His coat was still damp at the shoulders, his hat battered by the night, and he looked tired in a way that made him look, paradoxically, more himself than usual, as though the tiredness had stripped away the last of the careful surface and left something more essential. "Thank you for coming." "I told you," he said. "I'm not sorry about it." "I know," she said. "I'm thanking you anyway." He looked at her in the early light for a moment, and then he did something he hadn't done before. He reached out and pushed a strand of hair back from her face, a single brief gesture, matter-of-fact and tender at once, and then he dropped his hand. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she confirmed. He walked back up the street. She watched him go as she had before, except that now everything was different, and also exactly the same, and she went inside and climbed the stairs to her room and lay down on her bed with her boots still on, and was asleep within minutes. Spring came into itself in the weeks after the storm, as though the late April blizzard had been the last argument winter had, and, having made it, was willing to concede the rest. The school changed with the season. Her enrollment was at 18 now, the highest it had been, and the room that had felt large in October had become genuinely busy with the press of children in various stages of learning at various levels. She had started organizing them into loose groupings by ability rather than age, which meant on any given morning the left side of the room might be working on reading comprehension, while the right side did geometry, and a small cluster near the stove, Lucy Marsh and two others, worked through a set of problems she'd invented specifically for where they were. It was, she acknowledged to herself, unwieldy. But it worked, in the specific sense that children were actually learning rather than waiting for learning to be aimed at them. And that had always been the measure she cared about. Martha Ellison had become, without any formal arrangement, a junior helper. She arrived 30 minutes early on Tuesdays and Thursdays and helped the youngest students with their letters, which she did with a directness that was entirely her own and that worked better with most of the children than Evelyn's more patient approach. Martha had no patience for children who said they couldn't do something before they'd tried. "Show me what you've tried," she would say, in a tone that foreclosed argument. And the children, somehow, responded to this. They showed her what they'd tried. Evelyn watched this and thought about what it meant for Martha's future. She had started writing letters on Martha's behalf, carefully, without saying so directly, to a school in Cheyenne that took female pupils for advanced study. Whether George Ellison would allow it was another matter. But she was making the ground for the possibility, and that was what she could do. Sam Rafferty came in one morning in early May with a notebook filled with calculations she hadn't assigned. He set it on her desk before school started with the particular combination of pride and anxiety of someone presenting work they aren't sure will be received well. She looked through it. He had been working on the relationship between geometry and measurement, figuring out, on his own, how to calculate the area of irregular shapes by breaking them into triangles. It was not advanced mathematics, but he had figured it out independently, from first principles, and the logic of his working was sound throughout. "Sam," she said, "this is excellent." He stood very straight. "I know it's not what we were doing in class." "No," she said. "It's better. It's what we were doing in class plus something you added yourself. That's exactly what mathematics is for." He looked at the notebook and then at her. "My father says there's no practical use for this kind of thinking." She chose her words. "Your father runs a store," she said. "He measures and calculates every day. He does it the way he learned to do it, which works for him. What you're doing in this notebook would let you do it faster and more accurately and apply it to problems he hasn't encountered yet." She handed the notebook back. "Tell him that, if it comes up again." He took the notebook. "He won't believe me." "Probably not right away," she said, "but you'll have done work that's true regardless of whether he believes it. Keep doing true work." He nodded and went to his desk, and she thought about the fact that 9-year-olds should not have to carry the weight of a parent's skepticism about their own minds. And then she thought that they did anyway, and the only thing to do was give them enough ground to stand on that the weight didn't flatten them. The conversation with the Nathans passed, the fuller version of it, came on a Saturday in May when they were walking the perimeter of the schoolyard while she described her plans for making it usable for outdoor learning in good weather. He was listening and occasionally making practical suggestions. The ground there needed leveling. That fence post was rotten at the base. And she was drawing a rough diagram in her mind of what the space could become when he said, without particular preamble, I want to tell you something about the ranch, about why it matters to me the way it does. She stopped walking. He stopped too, looking at the fence post, then at her. Before Pennsylvania, he said. Before Clara. My family. My father. We rented. 3 different farms in 20 years, because the owners always eventually wanted the land back or raised the rent past what we could manage. Every time we built something, we built it in something that belonged to someone else, and that person could take it back. He paused. I watched my father work himself down to nothing on land he'd made better for someone else. I decided, young, that the only thing worth building was something you owned completely, something nobody could take back. She was quiet, listening. The ranch is that, he said. It's mine. I have the deed. Nobody can tell me to leave it. He looked at the fence post again. I know that sounds like something simple, but it wasn't simple to get there, and it doesn't feel simple. It's not simple, she said. It's the whole of what you worked for. Yes, he said, and I want you to understand that about me, that the ranch is it's not stubbornness. It's not independence for its own sake. It's the answer to a specific thing that happened to my family that I decided was not going to happen to me. She thought about her father, standing in the doorway of a farmhouse he'd owned for 20 years, watching her load her bags. She thought about the particular security of people who have a place that belongs to them, and the specific vulnerability of those who don't. I understand, she said. More than you might think. I know you do, he said. That's partly why I'm telling you. They stood in the May sun in the schoolyard, the fence post rotten between them and the Wyoming sky enormous overhead, and she thought about what it meant to build something that was yours. The school was not hers in the legal sense. It belonged to the district, to the community. But she had made it what it was, and that was a different kind of ownership, the kind you carry inside yourself. Nathan, she said. Yes. Ask my father properly, she said. Write him a letter first. He'll appreciate being written to first. It gives him time to think. A pause. I haven't asked you yet, he said. I know, she said. But I'm telling you what I want, which seems efficient. Something moved in his face. That particular near smile she had catalogued over the months with considerable thoroughness. Is that a yes? When you ask me, she said, I'll give you a yes. He looked at her steadily. The May light was warm on his face, and the scar on his jaw was barely visible in it, and he was so entirely himself, this man, so completely without pretense or performance, that she felt the full weight of how unlikely and how right this was, that 2 such careful people had managed to end up here, in a schoolyard in Wyoming, negotiating their future with the practical honesty of people who don't know how to do it any other way. Evelyn Hart, he said, will you marry me? Not a question, quite. More like a statement he was making and waiting to have confirmed. Yes, she said, I will. He nodded, once, as though filing this away in the category of things that were now settled and real. Then, I'll write your father tonight. He'll write back with 12 questions, she said. I'll answer all 12, he said. He might have more than 12. I'll answer those too. She turned back toward the schoolhouse because there were Saturday morning papers to review, and it was nearly 10 o'clock, and she was, when all was said and done, still the schoolteacher of Cedar Ridge on a work morning. He fell into step beside her. The fence post needs replacing this week, he said. I know, she said. I put it on the list. I'll bring timber Saturday. You're always bringing timber on Saturdays. You always need timber on Saturdays. She didn't argue with this because it was true. They went inside, and she sat at her desk, and he sat in his chair, and the Saturday morning arranged itself around them the way it always had, except that now everything was different, and also nothing had changed at all, and both of these things were entirely true simultaneously. The letter from her father arrived 3 weeks later. It was, as she had predicted, thorough. It ran to 4 pages and covered Nathan's landholding, his financial situation, his prospects, his family background, his character as assessed by any third parties her father had been able to consult. He had, remarkably, written to Calvin Dodd, whose name Evelyn had apparently mentioned enough times in her letters for her father to identify him as a useful source. And finally, in the last paragraph, having apparently satisfied himself on all practical grounds, her father had written, She tells me she is happy. She sounds like her mother, which I mean is the highest thing I can say. If you treat her with the respect she deserves, we will not have difficulties. If you don't, we will." Nathan read this at the kitchen table at the ranch on a Sunday afternoon. Evelyn watched his face while he read. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at it for a moment. "I like him," he said. "He's exactly like that in person," she said. "No different." "Good," Nathan said. "Consistent people are easier to deal with than inconsistent ones." She thought about what it would mean for her father to come here, to see this place, this life, the school and the town and the man she'd chosen. She wrote him back that week and invited him to make the journey for the wedding, whatever and whenever that would be, and in the invitation she wrote something she hadn't planned to write. "I know you thought I was making a mistake last October. I know you didn't say it again, but I know you thought it. I want you to know that I was probably making exactly the kind of mistake that was the right thing to do. I am not the person I was when I left. I am not sure I was fully a person yet when I left, or not the kind I wanted to be. I am now. Come and see." She sealed the letter before she could revise it. Quote, Cedar Ridge, by midsummer, had begun to feel like a place in a way it hadn't in the beginning. Not the idea of a place, not a settlement she had chosen and was tolerating, but a place she knew, whose rhythms she understood, whose people she cared about specifically and by name. Ida Marsh stopped by the schoolhouse on summer mornings when school was not in session, and they drank coffee and talked about things that ranged from the deeply practical to the thoroughly impractical, and the conversations had the quality of conversations between people who have decided to trust each other and have found, on testing, that the trust was justified. Calvin Dodd remained the town's primary information system, but he had stopped assessing her as an outsider some months ago and had started assessing her as a participant, which was different and which she appreciated. Even Barlow, at the general store, had thawed from neutral to something that included occasional unsolicited opinions about weather and crop prices, which was, for Barlow, extremely warm. She spent summer mornings at the ranch sometimes, helping Mrs. Alcott, who had accepted this development with the dry satisfaction of someone who has been watching it coming for 6 months and is privately pleased to have been right. She learned more of the ranch's workings. She learned where the water ran in the east pasture and how Nathan tracked the cattle numbers through the season and what needed watching in a dry summer versus a wet one. She did not learn these things because she expected to be a rancher's wife in the traditional sense. She was still the school teacher and intended to remain so, but because they were his, and understanding what was his seemed part of understanding him. He came to the school most mornings to check in, or she came to the ranch, and they ate breakfast sometimes at the ranch table, with Mrs. Alcott dispensing opinions alongside the biscuits. It was domestic without being settled, familiar without being diminished. And if it was not the romantic beginning she might have imagined at 19, sitting in her father's farmhouse in Illinois, it was something better than that imagined thing. It was actual. One evening in late July, sitting on the porch steps of the ranch with the sun going down over the western ridge and the air finally cooling after a long hot day, she found herself thinking about the night at the station in October. The dark platform, the 2 worn suitcases, the sound of a horse approaching from the north. How afraid she had been, and how she had stood straight anyway, and how the man who'd emerged from the dark had said, "You're not any trouble," like it was just a fact. She had come here for a school. She had found the school, and it was hers, and she had built it, and it would outlast her brief occupation of this time in her life. And the children in it were real and growing and would carry what they'd learned into futures she couldn't see. That was the thing she'd come for, and she had it. Everything else, the man sitting on the porch beside her, the ranch and its particular hard-won permanence, the town that had slowly opened around her like a fist unclenching, that had not been the plan. The plan had been narrow and purposeful, and life had been wider than the plan, as it tends to be when you show up to it honestly and let it show you what's actually there. "You're thinking," Nathan said beside her. "I usually am," she said. "Specific or general?" "October," she said. "The station." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the last of the sunset. "I almost didn't take that road," he said. "Keller's Creek goes north before it bends. The station road is a half-mile out of the direct route." "I know," she said. "I don't usually take it. It was habit, like I told you. I'd taken it every time I went to Keller's Creek for 3 years and stopped thinking about it." "So it wasn't a decision," she said. "It was just a habit you didn't break." Yes, he said. She thought about that. All the small, unconsidered choices that led to a specific place at a specific time. The particular accident of it. Not fate, not plan, but the uncountable ordinary things that compound into something that feels, afterward, inevitable. I'm glad you didn't break it, she said. So am I, he said. Now. The sky went from orange to purple to the dark blue of early night, and the first stars appeared, Wyoming stars, which were nothing like Illinois stars in their density and their closeness. And the two of them sat on the porch steps of the ranch that was his, that had cost everything to build, and said nothing further because nothing further was needed. Her father arrived on a Wednesday in late August, on the afternoon train. She was at the station to meet him, the proper station this time, the one in Cedar Ridge itself, which had a real platform and a sign and a bench, none of which the Millbrook stop had possessed. She stood on the platform in the afternoon heat and watched the train slow and thought, briefly, about another platform, another October evening, the particular feeling of standing in the dark waiting for something that didn't come. 10 months was not a long time. But the person who had stood at that dark stop with 2 worn suitcases and a letter folded in her coat pocket felt, in some important way, like someone she remembered rather than someone she still was. Her father stepped off the train and she knew him immediately. Of course she did. But there was a moment before he saw her where she could watch him take in the platform, the town beyond it, the Wyoming sky enormous and cloudless overhead, and his expression in that moment was the careful, assessing look of a man encountering something he'd built an opinion about and is now revising against the evidence of the actual thing. Then he saw her, and his face did something it didn't do often. "Evelyn," he said. "Papa," she said. He was not a demonstrative man. He hugged her briefly and held her at arm's length and looked at her face with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, though he didn't say so immediately. He said, "You look different." Different how? He thought about it. "Settled," he said, and then caught himself because that had been the word she'd told him wasn't quite right. "No, something else. Like you know where you are." "I do," she said. "Come on, I'll show you." She showed him the school first. It was summer and school was not in session, but the building was open. She kept it open most days because there were always 1 or 2 children who appeared wanting books or a quiet place to read, and she had never locked the door against that. Her father walked through the room slowly, looking at the blackboard still covered in the last week of June's final lesson. The desks arranged in their now familiar groupings, the shelf of books she'd added to steadily since October. He ran his hand along the edge of one of the repaired desks. "Nathan built that one," she said, "and the 2 beside it. In January, when I needed them and the board hadn't yet allocated money." Her father looked at the desk for a moment. He didn't say anything, but he looked at it with the particular attention of a man cataloging information he intends to use later. He met Nathan that evening at the ranch, where Mrs. Alcott had prepared a supper of the kind she reserved for occasions, which meant the good tablecloth and 3 kinds of vegetables and a pie that had taken most of the afternoon. Mrs. Alcott herself stayed for supper, which Evelyn suspected was partly practical hospitality and partly the woman's own assessment of how the evening needed to go, and she was right on both counts. Mrs. Alcott's presence shifted the atmosphere from a formal introduction between 2 cautious men into something that had to be, at least in part, a dinner, and dinners are easier than interrogations. Her father and Nathan sat across the table and spoke with the careful courtesy of men who have each decided to be measured rather than immediate, which suited them both and produced a conversation that was, for the first hour, almost entirely practical. The ranch, the land, the school, the town, the economics of frontier life. Her father asked specific questions. Nathan gave specific answers. Neither of them performed anything. She sat between them and ate Mrs. Alcott's roast and let them find each other at whatever pace they needed. The moment she'd been waiting for came after supper, when she was helping Mrs. Alcott in the kitchen and the 2 men had moved to the porch. She could hear them through the screen door, but could not make out the words clearly, only the cadence, which shifted from the measured exchange of the dinner table into something quieter and less structured. She did not go out. She let it happen. When she came out 20 minutes later with coffee, Her father was leaning on the porch rail looking at the Wyoming night sky, and Nathan was in the porch chair, and whatever had passed between them had settled something, because the quality of the silence was different. She handed her father his cup. He took it and looked at the sky a moment longer. "It's very far from Illinois," he said, to no one in particular. "Yes," she said. "It is." "Your mother would have liked it," he said. "She liked big skies." He took a sip of coffee. "She would have liked him too," he said, quieter, and did not look at either of them when he said it. "He doesn't explain himself too much. She always said that was the sign of a man who knew what he was about." Evelyn looked at Nathan. He was looking at his coffee cup, and there was something in his expression that was carefully composed but not entirely successful, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing that even the most careful person cannot entirely control. "Thank you," Nathan said, simply, without elaboration. Her father nodded and drank his coffee and said nothing further, and the Wyoming night was enormous and close around them all. The wedding was in September, when the worst of the summer heat had broken and the light had taken on the amber quality that she had come to love most about this place, long and warm-toned, turning everything it touched to something worth looking at. It was not a large ceremony. She had not wanted large. She had wanted true, which is a different requirement, and she had come to understand a harder one to meet. They married in the open air in the field behind the schoolhouse, because that felt right in a way that an indoor space did not. And because the field had good grass and a view of the western ridge, and because it was, more than any building in Cedar Ridge, hers, she had looked at it from the schoolhouse window every single day since October, and it had become, without her choosing it, a part of how she oriented herself in this place. Calvin Dodd organized most of it, because Calvin organized everything and was genuinely skilled at it, and because Evelyn, given a choice between planning a ceremony and planning the next school year's curriculum, would have chosen the curriculum without hesitation, and Calvin knew this. Ida Marsh made alterations to the one good dress Evelyn owned that transformed it into something she wouldn't have known to ask for. Still simple, but right in the way that simple things are right when they've been considered carefully. Martha Ellison arrived early and spent the morning moving chairs and was dismissive of any thanks for this, which was entirely consistent with her character. Sam Rafferty came with his family, including Henry Rafferty, who shook Nathan's hand with the brief, loaded quality of a man who has unfinished business he's decided to set aside for the day, and Nathan received the handshake without making anything of it, which was the exactly right response. The Garfields brought food. Mrs. Alcott brought more food. The result was a table that represented what Cedar Ridge produced in the way of abundance. Not refined, not elegant, but real and generous, and made with the particular care people take when they actually want something to go well. Her father walked her across the field. They walked slowly, because she was in no hurry, and because the afternoon light was doing exactly what it should, and she wanted to be present for it. Her father's arm was steady under her hand, and she was aware of him in the way she had been aware of him her whole life. This man who had not always known how to say what he felt and had loved her thoroughly anyway, in the specific language of showing up and staying and not leaving even when leaving would have been easier. "You were right," he said, about halfway across the field, not looking at her. She looked at him. "About?" "About this." A pause. "About needing to come somewhere you could build something yourself. Your mother did the same thing, in her way. I always thought you were like her. I should have trusted it more." She took a breath. "You trusted it enough," she said. "You let me go." "I didn't stop you," he said. "That's not quite the same as trusting it." "For you it is," she said. "I know the difference." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one, and they walked the rest of the way across the field, and at the end of it was Nathan, standing in the September light without his usual hat, his dark hair loose at his temples, looking at her with an expression that was unguarded in a way she had only seen a few times, and that she understood now was what his face did when he'd stopped managing himself entirely, and was just there. She took her place beside him. Her father sat down. The field was quiet except for the wind in the grass and the sounds of the people gathered there. 18, 20 people, this small town that had become hers, and the officiant began. She said the words she meant, and he said the words he meant, and none of it was performed, and all of it was true. There is something I have come to believe watching lives like these, not observed from a distance, but come close to, close enough to understand what they actually cost and what they actually built. We talk about courage as though it is always dramatic, as though it announces itself with a clear before and after, a moment you can point to and say, there, that is where the brave thing happened. But the truest courage I have ever seen is the kind Evelyn Hart carried across 10 months of a frontier winter. Not the single dramatic act, though she had those too, but the daily, unglamorous, incremental choice to stay. To show up to the schoolhouse when the cold was serious. To mark papers by a smoking stove. To face a room full of skeptical adults and let her records speak louder than their assumptions. To decline an easier life when it was offered and go back to the hard one, because the hard one was hers, and she had started something in it that mattered. We also talk about love as though it arrives, as though it is an event, a lightning strike, a single recognized moment. But the love in this story built itself the way the ranch was built, slowly, deliberately, in bad weather and good, through the accumulated weight of Saturday mornings and practical conversations and a north window caulked against a Wyoming winter. It did not arrive. It was constructed, and the things that are constructed are always sturdier than the things that merely happen. The Evelyn Hart who had sat at a dark train stop in October, frightened and alone and wondering if she'd made the worst mistake of her life, she had not been wrong to be frightened. The fear was honest and appropriate, and the situation was genuinely hard. What made the difference was not that the fear went away. It was that she did not let it be the last word. She stood up, she picked up her suitcases, she faced the dark road, and she kept going. That is the thing worth knowing. Not that it worked out, not that love was waiting, or that the town eventually accepted her, or that her students thrived. Those things are true, and they matter, but they are the result, not the lesson. The lesson is in the standing up. The lesson is in the doing of the next necessary thing when the necessary thing is hard and the outcome is not guaranteed. The lesson is in the choosing, every single day, to be in the place you've decided is yours and to do the work of making it so. The school year that began that October, her second, opened with 22 students. She had been awake before dawn on the first day, not from nervousness, but from the particular alertness of someone who is exactly where they should be and knows it and doesn't want to waste the morning being asleep. She lay in the ranch house, hers now too, in the specific way of things that have been formally claimed, and listened to the early sounds of the place and thought about the day ahead. Nathan was already up. She could hear him in the kitchen, the sound of the stove being stoked, the particular domestic sounds of a man who has been getting up before dawn for years and has no drama about it. She got up and dressed and went to find him, and he was standing at the stove with his back to her, and she watched him for a moment before he heard her and turned. "Coffee," he said. Not a question. He poured her a cup and set it on the table, and she sat down and drank it in the early dark while outside the Wyoming morning came in slowly at the edges. 22, she said. 22, he agreed. The Croft boys are both coming in this year, she said. Margaret Croft's driving them herself on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. That's a long drive. She said they'd been asking since June. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Daniel Croft figured out last spring that the internal angles of any triangle sum to 180 degrees. Without being taught it, he just worked it out from the examples I'd sent him. Nathan looked at her. What will you do with a student like that? Give him harder problems, she said, and then harder ones after that, and eventually write more letters to people who can teach him things I can't. He sat down across from her. The morning was coming in faster now, the gray at the kitchen window going lighter. You'll outgrow this school, he said. Eventually, you'll need more room, more teachers. I know, she said. I'm already thinking about it. He smiled at that. The full one, the rare one. Of course you are. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the early morning light, this man who had ridden through a blizzard and caulked a window and built 3 desks without saying so, and written a careful, thorough letter to her father that had answered every question, including the ones her father hadn't thought to ask yet. This man who had told her he loved her in a line shack during an April storm, because the storm had made the timing for him, and he'd have been a fool to waste it. She thought about what her father had said on the porch. She would have liked him. She thought about her mother, who had liked big skies and men who didn't explain themselves too much. and she thought that maybe some understanding of things passes through people across time without being said, and that arriving in the right place has as much to do with who you carry inside you as it does with any decision you make consciously. She didn't say any of this. She finished her coffee and stood up and put on her coat. "I'll be home by 4:30, she said. "I'll have the fence posts in by then," he said. "East pasture." "The ones I put on the list?" "The ones you put on the list," he confirmed. She picked up her bag from the hook by the door. He was still sitting at the table, watching her with the ease of a man who has found that watching someone he loves go about their ordinary morning is one of the better things available to him. "Nathan," she said. "Yes, thank you for being the kind of person you are." She said it plainly, because plain was how they did things, and because she meant it without qualification. "I know that's not a small thing, being that kind of person, consistently, over time. I don't take it lightly." He was quiet for a moment. "Same," he said. "Everything you just said, same." She opened the door. The September morning came in, cool and clear, the particular quality of early fall in Wyoming, the air carrying the smell of grass and distance, and something she had no name for that was simply the smell of this specific place that was now specifically hers. She walked to the school. 22 children arrived that morning, in pairs and small groups, noisy and shuffling and various and real. Sam Rafferty arrived early as usual, but this year he came in and went directly to the blackboard and wrote a problem he'd been working on over the summer. A geometry problem, an interesting one she didn't immediately know the solution to, and stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of someone who has made something worth making. Martha Ellison arrived precisely on time, sat in her seat, and opened her book without being asked. She had received a letter from the school in Cheyenne that summer. She had shown it to Evelyn, and not to her father yet, and they had talked about how to approach George Ellison, and Evelyn had said, "Tell him what you want directly. Don't argue for it, just tell him. Some people respond better to being told a thing clearly than to being persuaded." Martha had said she would think about it. Evelyn believed she would do it, because Martha did not spend long thinking when she'd already decided. Lucy Marsh sat in the front row and raised her hand before Evelyn had said anything at all. "Yes, Lucy," Evelyn said. "Are we going to keep reading Treasure Island?" Lucy asked. "We didn't finish last year." "We're going to start something new," Evelyn said. Lucy's face considered this. "What?" Evelyn reached under her desk and produced a book she'd ordered from Chicago in June that had arrived in August that she had been waiting to introduce. She held it up. "This," she said. The room leaned forward with the collective instinct of people who have learned that the thing being offered is worth wanting. She opened to the first page. The morning light came through the 4 windows of the schoolhouse, the north window sealed tight and true, and 22 children sat in the desks of Cedar Ridge and waited to hear what came next. She began to read. Ye, the frightened 19-year-old who had stood alone in the October dark, wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life, had not made a mistake. She had made a beginning, and beginnings are not meant to be comfortable. They are meant to be true, which is a harder thing to be, and a better one, and the only kind that lasts. She was 20 years old now. She was a wife and a teacher, and a person that this town had taken into itself the way good ground takes seed, slowly, with resistance at first, and then completely. She had built something here that would outlast her tenure. She had found something here that she had not known to look for. She was not done. The school would grow and the work would compound, and the days would continue to be harder than expected and better than expected in equal and uneven measure. Her father would come back at Christmas and would sit at the ranch table and speak to Nathan with the ease of men who have found their common ground and built something practical on it. Martha Ellison would go to Cheyenne the following year after a conversation with her father that went better and worse than expected, and would come back 2 years later with a teaching certificate and a set of opinions about pedagogy that she and Evelyn would argue about productively for years. Sam Rafferty would grow into the mind he'd always had, and it would take him further than Cedar Ridge, and he would come back to it anyway. None of this was certain yet, that September morning. None of it was guaranteed. The future was still the frontier, unmapped, demanding, lit only as far ahead as you could see. But Evelyn Hart had learned over the past year that you don't need to see the whole road. You need to know the next step and be willing to take it. The rest reveals itself to the people who stay. She read to her students, and the morning moved around them, and outside the window the Wyoming world went on in its large and indifferent and beautiful way. And inside, the 22 children of Cedar Ridge learned something, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.